Israeli leaders and commanders are fully aware of the fact that Israel is a small state, that it cannot take on an enemy the size of Iran, not necessarily a powerful enemy, but an enemy the size of Iran for a prolonged period without significant assistance from the United States and from other allies. And I think that is definitely something that Israeli leaders are considering. So I'm not sure if one could say they've reached their limit. And I think with American assistance, they certainly can outpower and outgun Iran. But the question is, do they want to push themselves to the brink like that?
Israeli airstrikes hit targets across Iran in what was called proportional attacks. They were in response to Iran's drone and ballistic missile barrage at the beginning of this month. Iranian state media says the damage has been limited and it does not appear that Israel targeted nuclear or oil targets. However, it does still mark another escalation of tensions in the Middle East. We're going to talk now to Professor Mehran Kamrava, Professor of Government at Georgetown University in Qatar. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you. Was this the kind of response that you personally were expecting from Iran?
No, from Iran or Israel.
Yes, from Israel.
Yes. No, I think everybody was somewhat surprised initially at the limited scale of the Israeli retaliatory attack on Iran. You know, there's been so many strikes and retaliations, it's hard to keep up with them. But this was Israel's retaliation for Iran's retaliation on October 1. And I think we were all expecting a major and devastating Israeli attack. And that didn't come to pass. And the reason appears to be that the Americans prevailed on the Israelis not to attack Iranian nuclear sites or Iran's oil installations because of then Iranian strikes, Iranian retaliation in turn. And so this was actually surprising, a pleasant surprise in its limited nature.
Is there a sense of perhaps complacency here? There's a lot of talk at the moment, you know, on news outlets that there was an element of choreography and, as you say, Western influence and consensus around this. But things are unpredictable. Is there a chance that this isn't the closing chapter in this exchange that people hope this is?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think we should fool ourselves and think this was the end of it. There are different scenarios. One can say that, well, last night Israel took out Iran's defensive capabilities, its missile capabilities, either tonight or at some undetermined point in the future. It'll hit Iran's other targets. Or there are now reports that on Friday, Israel told Iran through diplomatic channels that it would engage in a limited attack and that this would be it. So I think no one in Iran or in Israel is fooling themselves into thinking this was it. But at the same time, I think there is considerable room for hope, if we can be hopeful under current circumstances, that at least this round might have come to an end.
And, you know, in terms of Israel's capacity, is there a point at which they want this to come to an end? Because they're engaged in Gaza, they're also engaged to a degree in Lebanon. Now with Iran, are they potentially at the limit of their military scope?
That's an excellent question. I don't know if they're at their limit, but I think Israeli leaders and commanders are fully aware of the fact that Israel is a small state, that it cannot take on an enemy the size of Iran, not necessarily a powerful enemy, but an enemy the size of Iran for a prolonged period without significant assistance from the United States and from other allies. And I think that is definitely something that Israeli leaders are considering. So I'm not sure if one could say they've reached their limit. And I think with American assistance, they certainly can outpower and outgun Iran. But the question is, do they want to push themselves to the brink like that?
I mean, there is a sense that some of what's happened recently has been in a kind of vacuum with Joe Biden as a kind of lame duck president. Would there have been, with the American election coming up very fast, a sense that any more sort of conflict and escalation in the area was more than the US could cope with at this point?
I think so. Again, I think you're spot on. The Biden administration has proven itself to be quite weak diplomatically. It's been, in many ways, sleepwalking into war. And Secretary of State Blinken keeps traveling around, apparently with no effect. The carnage in Lebanon is going unabated. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine continues unabated. Now there's dangers of escalation with Iran. And in the meanwhile, we have a very indecisive American president. And I think, of course, the elections in the United States are a huge factor. And I should also mention, incidentally, that the fact that Israel's attack on Iran appears to have been limited is in large measure in order not to impact significantly the outcome of the American election in about 10 days' time.
Okay, well, thanks very much for appearing on the show. That was those were the views of Professor Mehran Kamrava from Georgetown University in Qatar.
Israel has struck Iran, including the capital Tehran, with what it calls precise and targeted airstrikes. It's Israel's retaliation to Iran launching a barrage of over 180 ballistic missiles at Israeli cities earlier this month. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, says Iran should not now respond to this wave of Israeli strikes and has urged restraint on all sides. Shashank Joshi is the defence editor for The Economist. Shashank, good morning.
Good morning.
Very good to speak to you. First of all, your analysis then on, I suppose, first of all, why this took so long by way of retaliation for Iran's barrage of missiles at the beginning of the month.
Well, if you were striking the upper range of targets, such as oil refineries, nuclear sites, you would know what you're hitting. It's a relatively known number of sites. This is a sort of somewhere in the middle of the range. It wasn't as isolated and as small as the April strike that was against one radar at one Iranian base. It was over 100 aircraft, a number of sites, including missile production factories that may have been underground. So there may have been considerable preparation required in terms of intelligence, understanding civilians nearby. But there's also a diplomatic aspect to this, which is that this has been preceded by a heavy wrangling between the White House and Israel over what's an acceptable sort of thing to strike, particularly without causing major disruption ahead of the US election in just a few days.
What has this retaliation achieved?
It's too early to say what it's achieved. All I can probably say is what we think it struck, and that's a number of sites across Tehran's southern, southwestern, western Iran. And it looks as though these were all military sites, so these weren't energy-related sites, these weren't political sites or the leadership targets. And they included things like missile factories, drone factories, according to the initial reports. I'd be surprised if they also didn't target some sort of aircraft facilities. But also, it's important to understand, in part to facilitate this strike, but also as an end in itself, they hit air defense systems, both inside Iran and, it appears, in Syria and Iraq, possibly to smooth the route for Israel's planes. And the importance of that is not just that it made the strikes possible with less risk to Israeli planes. It's also important because if air defense sites are damaged or destroyed, it makes follow-on Israeli strikes later on, whether this month or next month or down the line, easier as well.
Understood. I'm quite struck, Shashank, this morning by reporting from the Times' George Grills, which is kind of reflective of the messaging that's emerging from Iran and from Israel in the aftermath of this retaliation. And I suppose what we can read into it, I suppose. So Iran is playing down the impact of the attacks, saying they caused slight damage. Allies of Israel have been told this morning that Iran's air defences were completely neutralised. And so I'm kind of taking both of these things and working out, is this both sides spinning, propaganda, basically, playing their own message up, amplifying their own message? Is that what this is?
That's what we expect in all wars. But if you go back to the April strike, which you might recall, of course, Iran fired a number of missiles, hundreds of missiles at Israel. Israel responded. In that response, Iran said, nothing really happened. There were a few small quadcopter drones and that's it. They didn't come clean on the missile strike. In fact, they haven't really acknowledged it until very, very recently indeed. Some officials have said, look, we were hit by a fairly substantial missile. And I think that tells you it's more important to the Iranians to really conceal what happened from their public. And in part, that suits Israel because it means they don't feel the Iranians have to save face by offering a very aggressive response that could lock us into another cycle of strike and counterstrike. So, in some strange way, this this Iranian playing down of the damage suits the Iranian leadership, and it also suits the Israeli leadership.
One of the other parts of this is that the UN human rights boss Volker Turk has called an offensive by Israel in northern Gaza the darkest moment of Gaza's war. There's bombing, there's the risk of starvation as part of that offensive. And I just consider that is also happening. Israel is also fighting elsewhere. Indeed, they talk of this war on 7 fronts, don't they?
Well, as the airstrikes began, there were also substantial artillery strikes on northern Gaza against what the IDF claimed were Hamas targets. And, there are still 400,000 people in Gaza City. That area has been cut off from the rest of the territory, subject to an evacuation order. And to give you an indication of how concerned people are, the American government, which of course is very close to Israel, is arming Israel, is a very, very intimate ally of Israel, is writing letters saying, we hear reports that you're trying to starve out the population in northern Gaza. Please tell us that's not true. Please show that's not true. And what that tells you is that even Israel's very closest ally, I think, is quite concerned by some of the things it's reading and seeing around Israel's plan for northern Gaza. Of course, from Israel's perspective, they'll be saying, well, you told us not to go into Rafah in the south, and we did it, but that's where Yahya Sinwar was. That's where these hostages were. So we're going to thank you, but we're going to go do it our own way.
Shashank Joshi, thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Very good to speak to you. Shashank Joshi is the defence editor for The Economist.